Welcome to this video brought to you especially for ARC KSS Researchers Week. We are delighted that Dr. Julie Macinnes has shared with us details of the methodological basis of using mixed methods. Julie is a research fellow at the Centre for Health Services Studies at the University of Kent and is an experienced mixed methods researcher. We hope you find this session helpful, so I'll hand straight over to Julie for her session entitled Mixed Methods Research or Mixed Up Methods.
Well, let's get down to the practicalities of it then. There's three important decisions. So the title of this presentation was Mixed Methods or Mixed Up Methods. So how to do good mixed methods research as opposed to just chucking some methods in a bag and mixing them around and seeing what comes out. What's important is weighting. And by that, what we mean is the relative emphasis or the priority. So whilst some studies may use qualitative and quantitative data collection methods and data analysis in the same study, sometimes it's very clear that actually the relative weight is towards one or the other. So, for example, in behavioural sciences, you could have a survey, a questionnaire, which is analysed quantitatively. But you may then just have an open question at the end saying, do you want to add anything or do you have any comments about the things you've just answered? So that is coming from a very positivist quantitative approach. The bulk of your data is about measurable quantitative data. However, you might throw in a qualitative open question into that survey. But in that case, the weighting is very much, the priority is given very much to the quantitative. And sometimes in studies, they won't even report that in academic journals, for example. So weighting, sometimes it's not clear and it's kind of probably 50-50. For others, there's a clear clear direction, and it's normally in the quantitative direction, I have to say. What's really important as well is something called timing. So do you collect and analyse your data, your qualitative and quantitative data sequentially, i.e. do you do one first and then you analyse it and then you do the next one, or do you collect both types of data or multiple sources of data at the same time and analyse them together? So concurrent or sequential. And I would say probably 70%, I'm guessing here, of mixed methods studies in healthcare, health and social care are around sequential. And what's important as well is the mixing. So it's the relationship between the data sets and how they're connected. So if you're going to collect qualitative and quantitative data to answer your question, at what point do they come together? Do you connect them in terms of making inferences or conclusions or recommendations? So where do they kind of connect? Where do they intersect? And I'll give you some examples in a while, and hopefully that will make that last point a bit more clear. So this is a revised typology, or really what we mean is categories, if you like, of mixed methods. And as I said, probably as well as Tashikori and Tedley, the leading authors are Creswell and Plano-Clark here. They did have a typology or categorization of multiple, I think it was about 12 or something types, but they've honed that down now to just three broad types of designs for collecting mixed methods: the explanatory sequential design, the exploratory sequential design, and convergent or concurrent design. So they've kind of paired it back to three broad types of doing mixed methods, if you like. So the first one is what's called explanatory sequential mixed methods design. So sequential tells you about the timing. So it tells you that there's one data collection and then another one following it. So it's obviously sequential. So two distinct phases, and the first phase is the collection and analysis of quantitative data, followed by the collection and analysis of qualitative data. So quan, then qual. And the purpose here is that the qualitative aims to explain the quantitative results. And again, Ilira, you gave a lovely example of just that. So you've collected quantitative data around blood sugars, but in order to explain that, you then need to get more data. And I know we're talking about clinical practice here, but actually it transfers into research in exactly the same way. So we're going to get some quantitative data, but then if we want to understand or explain those results, then we will collect qualitative or use other kinds of ways of collecting data. So we would talk to the patient, for example, find out what their behaviour is like, etc., etc. So the purpose is to explain or understand or expand on the quantitative results. So the qualitative stage is designed so that it follows on. So it's sequential to the quantitative phase. So we could use things like focus groups might be used to explain if you've got kind of a correlation. So for example, we might, taking the vaccinations again, we might be interested in finding out about who is taking up the vaccines or not. So we might be interested in vaccination, and we might be interested in socio-economic groups or socio-economic class. You're looking potentially at, there is some quantitative results, but how do we explain that? So we would collect some quantitative data to look at the correlation between vaccinations perhaps and socio-economic class. But then if we want to explain that, we're probably going to need some qualitative data around, what is it what is it about class and environment and culture and families that influence whether or not people take up a vaccination. So quantitative first, followed by qualitative, and the aim is to explain the quantitative data with the qualitative data. So this is what it looks like. So we collect some quantitative data collection and we analyse that. So we collect some data, we analyse it, and then we collect some qualitative data, we analyse that, and then we make some interpretation or some conclusions as a result of that process. Difficulties with carrying out explanatory sequential designs of mixed methods? Well, all mixed methods, they take a long time, because if you're collecting two kinds of data, particularly in a sequential way, that's going to take some time. So these tend to be quite long studies. Because the qualitative data is dependent on the quantitative, you can't, from the very beginning of the study, say what your qualitative stage is going to look like. So, for example, if we wanted to collect some, clinical data, and then based on that results, then go and talk to people or patients to try and explain that phenomenon, we wouldn't be able to develop our interview schedule, for example, or a focus group schedule, or any other qualitative methods until we've analysed the quantitative. So you can't, from the outset of a study, say what exactly you're going to do for the qualitative. And ethics committees are a little nervous about that, although they're getting better. And the other thing is, of course, you then need to decide which of your quantitative findings you're going to go on to explore. So again, that in itself is a qualitative interpretivist decision in terms of because you won't be able to explore every aspect of that quantitative data. You'll have to be selective, and that in itself is an interpretivist subjective process. Just to add in here as well generally about mixed methods is sometimes they're difficult to publish only because they're long. As well as being a lengthy process, if you write up a mixed method study for publication, you tend to be looking at sort of 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 words. And journals just don't publish articles of that size, or they have a particular paradigm that they subscribe to. So mixed methods can be difficult to publish. And what some people do, and by necessity, is they just carve it up. So they will publish the quantitative phase and they will publish the qualitative phase separately. So there's probably many more mixed method studies out there, but you're only seeing them reported as one or the other because of various reasons. Sometimes it's about the journal, but often it's about the length of the article. So Creswell and Plano-Clark now talking about exploratory sequential designs. And here you begin with a very broad kind of question. So it begins with, and typically prioritize the collection of qualitative data. And then from that qualitative data, so from our exploration of a phenomenon, we then go on to test it quantitatively. And again, there are examples of this. So if there's a topic or a phenomenon that we know very little about, so there isn't theories developed already about it, then we might need to do some qualitative work to try and to help us to understand that phenomenon in a bit more detail. So we're theory building here, we're developing theory. And remember, positivism and quantitative data is all about theory testing, whereas qualitative or interpretivist approaches are about theory building. So where we don't know much about a topic, then you might need to do some qualitative exploratory data collection first, and then we kind of have an idea. We then start to build theories, and then we can test those theories in a larger representative sample in a quantitative phase. So it's the reverse of our explanatory sequential design, in that here we begin with qualitative and then we move on to quantitative. So this is again, a kind of typical. So you'll collect some qualitative data, which might be interviews. And then you analyse that data, and then you might develop a quantitative measure or quantitative instrument. So now you're theory building, and now you're going to test that instrument, you're going to test that theory in a larger quantitative, more representative sample to see if it kind of bears out in bigger populations. Is it generalizable? Does it bear out in bigger populations? So that's a typical kind of exploratory sequential. Again, same issues really. It's lengthy. We can't specify the quantitative phase in advance because we don't know what our questionnaire might look like, for example, until we've done our qualitative data and until we've thought about what our theories might be. So, and again, it's the same issue. Qualitative data will generate potentially loads of themes, and then you have to think, okay, which are the most important? Which are the ones that need to be tested quantitatively? So that subjective selection process, because you will not be able to follow up on every qualitative result. So our convergent or concurrent design, this is the one that's most like what we've talked about in terms of methodological triangulation. So this is where we collect two separate data sets, qualitative and quantitative, because that's what's making it mixed methods. And then we combine and compare those results kind of simultaneously. So sometimes that can be answering the same question of both. And I'll try and explain that really. So you could be, so let's take the breast screening, let's stick with that then. So you could say, okay, I'm going to do a survey and I'm going to do some interviews. I'm going to do them, obviously you don't necessarily do them in time, both at exactly the same time, but so I'm going to do some interviews. I'm also going to do a survey, but I'm not going to analyze either one before the other. I'm just going to collect the data, then I'm going to analyze them, and then I'm going to compare to see whether I'm getting the same results in both. So you can ask the same questions, if you like, or broadly similar questions in both qualitative or quantitative. And that's triangulation. That's the benefits of one offsetting the weaknesses of the other. So your quantitative will be in a bigger sample. It's you'd go for representation, for example. You'd look at generalizability, whereas qualitative will look at the more nuanced, the more kind of subtle, the explanations and the meaning behind what you're finding. To me, if you're asking the same question of both qualitative and quantitative results, data, and this is just a personal view really, you don't have enough confidence in either method, in a word. So the fact that you don't have enough confidence in your quantitative data, that you have to do qualitative as well, to me, this is the oldest type of mixed methods, and it does come from this kind of lack of confidence about one data set, predominantly qualitative, it has to be said. So qualitative researchers felt the need to also connect quantitative data just to show that it was kind of somehow more robust or reliable, which of course it isn't. That's all dependent on the quality of what you're collecting, the data that you're collecting. So more usually now, we don't collect qualitative and quantitative to answer exactly the same thing. We collect them because they're asking slightly different things within the same topic. So we wouldn't be asking exactly the same, we wouldn't be trying to get the same thing from qualitative and quantitative. We'd be looking at some other experiences. So if we take remote consultations, for example, we could do focus groups to find out about staff experience of remote consultations. That would be our qualitative bit, if you like. But we could also then look at potentially some audit data. We could potentially look at how many remote consultations are taking place. How long do they last, perhaps, compared to face-to-face? Who is doing those? Is it the same people who seem to be doing this? You might want to do satisfaction surveys with remote consultation. So here you've got an overarching topic, which is remote consultation, but you're using your qualitative and your quantitative methods to answer slightly different things about it to give an overall picture. And that's more, I think that's a more modern way of thinking of mixed methods. And it's kind of replaced this triangulation and not having the confidence in either more, I think. So very simply, here's your qualitative data, here's your quantitative data, and then we look at the results, we look at what they're telling us, and we produce some overall conclusions about that in our interpretation. So challenges, they're a little bit different. If you've got two different data sets, qualitative and quantitative, just because of the traditions they come from, quantitative, you're going to have much larger sample sizes with a quantitative survey than you will with qualitative. Does that matter? Probably not really, because that's a kind of characteristic of the research you're doing, whether it's qualitative, large sample size, or quantitative, smaller sample size. So it's not really a challenge, I don't think. We just kind of ignore the fact that you've got different sample sizes. You're not merging the data in that way. You're not quantifying the qualitative or qualifying the quantitative, so the sizes don't really matter. Merging the data sets here is difficult. And as I said, it helps if they address the same concept. So if you're asking the same things of both, then it's kind of easier to kind of make inferences. But if they're asking different questions, then you're basically answering different aspects of that question in your interpretation. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges with mixed methods, and that's the need to explain any divergence when comparing results. And that might lead you to go back and collect more data, or go back to re-examine the data you've already collected. So it's when your qualitative results tell you one thing and your quantitative results tell you something different. And then that begs the question, well, which of those do you now believe? Because, and this is why it's easy if you're just using, a positivist quantitative approach or a qualitative interpretivist, because they're the results you get and you interpret them. But when they conflict, and I would say they almost always do, just because of the nature of the design, really. So it's highly likely that there will be a difference between your qualitative and your quantitative data. And you need to kind of explain that somehow. So just to give you a very brief kind of example from some research that I did, it was about heart failure. It was about patients' experiences of heart failure, particularly around self-management, actually. But what I found from talking to patients, because it was qualitative first, is that heart failure had a huge emotional impact on them, on people. They didn't have confidence to go out. Some people were even talking about suicide. So it had a huge emotional impact. I then developed a questionnaire to test some theories, so in an explanatory sequential design. And when I did the questionnaire to, I think it was about 300 people with heart failure in the end, emotional concerns or negative emotional impact just did not feature. People told me that they were fine emotionally. How on earth do you then reconcile that to say, well, actually, does heart failure have an emotional impact or does it not? And that then forces you to go back to re-examine your kind of concepts and your sample. So, and if we had time, I'd ask you what some of the reasons would be for that, but I'm conscious that we're running out of time today. But so what did I conclude? Well, I thought, first of all, there is something about that qualitative sample, and it was not about the sample size. But if you put out a kind of advert, or if you recruit people with heart failure to talk about their experiences, people who perhaps are having a difficult time of it emotionally might be the ones that come forward and say, yeah, I'd like to talk to you about my heart failure. I want to get it off my chest. So the qualitative sample may have been self-selecting for those people who did have perhaps emotional issues with dealing with heart failure. So that's one explanation. The alternative explanation is, of course, that a survey an impersonal quantitative survey that people will fill in, or perhaps even their relatives will fill in for them, doesn't get people to open up about the emotional aspects of heart failure as a qualitative interview would. So the one alternative view is, of course, the quantitative just didn't engage people in those conversations the way the qualitative did. So people do suffer emotionally from heart failure, but it's not being picked up in a questionnaire. You need to talk to people for them to tell you about it. So, but a real problem then is, what do you do when you have data which conflict potentially? And you have to then go back to re-examine your methods, your sample, your assumptions. So it's quite a nice process, but it's a bit unsettling. I just want to finish off, because I appreciate you may not go on to do mixed method studies. You may be familiar with CASP checklists. So if you just Google it, you'll find these. These are checklists for assessing qualitative and quantitative research in academic papers. So if you're looking at a study and it's quantitative in nature, there is a CASP checklist that say, if this is a good quantitative article, it will have this, this, and this. It will tell you about sample size. It will tell you, it will have power calculations in it. It will have blah, blah, blah. So it's a checklist of what makes a good quantitative paper. There's also a checklist of what makes a good qualitative paper. But until recently, there wasn't a checklist which showed us how to appraise mixed methods. But now there's something by Hong, and it's 2018. It's called the MAT or MMAT. I'm not sure how they pronounce it. And basically, it's a checklist that if you have a mixed method study, you can go through that checklist and say, yeah, this answers all those kind of questions. And it includes things like, so is there a good reason for using mixed methods? Do the authors actually say, yeah, this is why I'm using mixed methods? So essentially, is there evidence that is adding value, or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? Are the different components, qualitative and quantitative, effectively integrated to answer the research question? So do both those different data collection processes help you answer that research question? How has it been analysed? So are the outputs of qualitative and quantitative adequately interpreted and analysed? So this is about data analysis. And this is that point about the heart failure example. Are any divergences or inconsistencies between the data discussed, addressed? And often that's just kind of like, well, it could be this, it could be the other. And do the different components of the study adhere to the quality criteria of those traditional methods? So again, that's our quantitative and our qualitative CASP checklists.